In Mexico, they were called bandidos. On the high seas, they were known as buccaneers or pirates. And in the Wild West, they were immortalized as gunslinging outlaws. But down under, in the wilderness of Britain's newly established colonies, escaped convicts used the Australian bush as their refuge while they plundered, robbed, murdered, and fought back against their colonial oppressors. These rugged rogues were known as the Bushrangers. Welcome back to Shadow Matter, where in today's episode, we'll be starting a series on the legendary, brutal, and occasionally strange Australian outlaws of its colonial past, referred to as Bushrangers. If this is your first time here, hello and welcome. Consider subscribing to see more content on a darker side of our world with an Australian focus. If you would like to learn more about today's episode, all links of sourced information can be found in the description of this video. So join me as we explore the rough and wild history of the Australian bushranger. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the term bushranger is described as any of the bandits of the Australian bush or outback who harassed the settlers, miners, and Aborigines of the frontier in the late 18th and 19th centuries. The characters of which had been born into folklore and pop culture catapulted them into legendary status such as Ben Hall or Ned Kelly, but also have been described as thuggish, brute, and nothing more than common thieves. Up until the 1850s, bushrangers were almost exclusively escaped convicts in the early years of British settlement of Australia. After the 1850s, due mostly to decline of convict transportation, the escaped convict bushranger gradually morphed into the desperado of the Australian bush that has solidified itself into Australia's conscience of modern day. This was due in part thanks to Australia's gold rush in the state of Victoria between 1850 and 1870. The bushrangers' heyday was also during these 2 decades, as the discovery of gold gave bushrangers access to great wealth that was portable and easily converted into cash. Most of the notable bushrangers came from this period of time, but not all were exclusively gold thieves. In New South Wales, bushranging became a popular lifestyle choice for those born of poor ex-convicts in attempts to better their own lives, as it was the rewards of being an outlaw that appeared to be greatly favoured over the alternative of mining or farming life. Essentially, the Australian bushranger is comparable to the outlaw of the American Old West or the British highwayman. In May of 1787, the first fleet of British ships carrying over 1,400 convicts, marines, sailors, and free settlers left Portsmouth, England, and arrived in the soon-to-be penal colony of New South Wales 1 year later. This began the first era of bushrangers, who were essentially escaped convicts known as bolters during this time. These men preferred the wild and would raid farms and steal supplies. Occasionally, the bolters would join arms with Australia's Indigenous people and even helped fight in the frontier wars against their colonial authorities. In this era, weaponry utilised by bushrangers consisted mainly of stolen muskets and flintlock pistols, although axes and cutlasses were also popular. John Caesar, nicknamed Black Caesar, was a Madagascan-born colonial penal convict sent to Australia initially for 7 years, but would escape his incarceration a total of 4 times. He would hide in the bush and steal from settlers and other ne'er-do-wells. John Caesar is often cited as the first notable bushranger and one of the first people of African descent to live in Australia. He was shot dead at Liberty Plains in 1796. An outbreak of escaped convicts in Van Diemen's Land, which is modern-day Tasmania, resulted in an introduced martial law to help combat the overwhelming population of bolters. Self-styled Lieutenant of the Woods bushranger Michael Howe was clubbed to death in Van Diemen's Land, ending a 7-year career of robbery, murder, and civil unrest. 1824. Notorious bushranger Matthew Brady and 15 other convicts escaped from their penal settlement at Sarah Island and would spend the next 2 years as one of Australia's most infamous bushrangers. Aboriginal bushranger and Indigenous resistance leader Mosquito was hanged on the 25th of February, 1825 at Old Hobart Jail, being found guilty of murder. An outbreak of bushranging near Bathurst in New South Wales consisted of 80 convicts and bushrangers, and is now referred to as the Bathurst Rebellion. Led by Ralph Entwistle, leader of the Ribbon Boy gang, laid siege to the then small settlement of Bathurst for close to 2 months, eventually ending in October of 1830, and the Bushrangers were put on trial and subsequently hanged for their crimes. Gold is found in Victoria, leading to the Victorian gold rush of the 1850s and 1860s, and thus changing the face of bushranging in Australia. Australia's largest ever gold heist takes place at Escort Rock, New South Wales. The Bushrangers' Gardner Hall gang, led by Frank Gardner and Ben Hall, ambushed a gold escort coach and made off with an estimated £14,000. The New South Wales government passes a bill, the Felons Apprehension Act, that gave anyone the legal right to shoot outlawed bushrangers on sight. Australia's longest free-roaming bushranger, Frederick Ward, aka Captain Thunderbolt, is shot dead on May the 25th at Kentucky Creek near Uralla after allegedly robbing some travellers. His death was the cause of a conspiracy, and many believed he did not die and escaped into hiding. The entire small town of Jerilderie in New South Wales is held up by Australia's best-known outlaw, Ned Kelly, and his gang. During the hold-up, Kelly left a 56-page handwritten letter detailing his version of events that led him to be outlawed. The letter also denounces the police, the Victorian government, and the British Empire, while also outlining the injustices that he and his family had suffered, to somewhat justifying his outlawry. Today, this letter is known as the Jerilderie Letter. 1880. After 2 years of eluding police, Ned Kelly is captured after the famous shootout with police at Glenrowan, while he and his gang donned bulletproof armour fashioned from old farming equipment. Ned Kelly survived his wounds to stand trial in October of 1880, but was ultimately sentenced to death in November of that same year, effectively ending the century-long era of Australian bushrangers. Although other lesser-known bushrangers were known to be active after Kelly, they had far less influence on the Australian public than their predecessors. John Black Caesar was born in 1764 in Madagascar and transported to Australia on the First Fleet. He was nicknamed Black Caesar and today is remembered as Australia's first bushranger and person of African descent to arrive in Australia. Born Joseph Bolitho Johns, is perhaps Western Australia's most known bushranger, better known as Moondine Joe. He was an English convict born into a poor family and suffered relatively difficult circumstances. He developed a life as a petty criminal with a strong sense of self-determination. He was known to escape from prison on multiple occasions. Mosquito was an Indigenous Australian bushranger and resistance leader from the Broken Bay region of Sydney. Mosquito was involved in raids against the British and their settlements in and around the Hawkesbury River area in 1805. He spent some years imprisoned on Norfolk Island before being moved to Tasmania, or back then as it was known as Van Diemen's Land, where in 1813 he formed the Oyster Bay tribe. Matthew Brady, 1799 to 1826. Matthew Brady was an English-born convict who became a bushranger in Van Diemen's Land after being transported there. He was sometimes dubbed Gentleman Brady in relation to his reportedly good hospitality and treatment when robbing his victims. Dan Morgan. Born John Fuller, Dan Morgan was an Australian bushranger known for his erratic behaviour and violent mood swings. Nicknamed Mad Dog, he was regarded during his bushranging career as the most bloodthirsty and violent of his contemporaries. After he killed a trooper in July of 1864, the New South Wales government placed a £1,000 bounty on his head. He was shot and killed after holding up Peachelba Station in Victoria in 1865. Thomas Jeffries, also known as Mark Jeffries, or simply just Thomas Jeffrey, was an English-born convict bushranger, serial killer, and cannibal in 19th century Tasmania. Jeffries was transported for 7 years in 1823, and he and other convicts absconded from custody in 1825. Whether the reports are true or not only adds to this man's infamy, in which several murders were committed, one victim being an infant and the other of his gang being cannibalized. Ben Hall. Ben Hall was an Australian-born bushranger. He and his gang carried out many raids across New South Wales during his outlaw career. What's notable about Ben Hall is, unlike his contemporaries, he was not directly responsible for any deaths, although several of his associates were. He and fellow bushranger Frank Gardner were responsible for Australia's largest gold heist, taking over £14,000 worth of gold. Hall was shot dead by police in May of 1865 at Billabong Creek. The police claimed that they were exercising their rights under the Felons Apprehension Act, which legally granted anyone the right to shoot and kill without warning to anyone named by the government as an outlaw. However, at the time of Hall's death, the act had not yet come into force, resulting in considerable controversy. Ben Hall later became a well-known figure in Australian folklore, and many songs, ballads, books and films have been inspired by him. Ned Kelly. One of the last bushrangers, and by far the most famous, Ned Kelly came from a poor Irish Catholic family of 8 children. His upbringing was very colourful, as at the age of 12, his father died, he became man of the house, and quite often was involved in disputes with the law, which saw him being sent to prison twice as a teenager, one time for associating with a bushranger named Harry Power. The Kelly family saw themselves as victims of the squatters and their monopoly of wealth through land ownership, and also police harassment. Ned was serving his longest stretch in prison from 1871 to 1874 on a conviction of receiving a stolen horse. He later joined a group of bush larrikins called the Greta Mob, who were known for stock theft. After an altercation at the Kelly's family home in 1878 with a police officer, Kelly was indicted for his attempted murder, but fleeing into the bush, the authorities arrested Kelly's mother instead. Vowing to avenge his mother, the Kelly gang, made up of Kelly's brother, Dan, and friends Joe Byrne and Steve Hart, were declared outlaws by the government of Victoria after shooting 3 policemen dead at Stringybark Creek. The Kelly gang eluded police for 2 years while continuing on a crime spree which included raids on Euroa and Jerilderie. During this time, Ned Kelly had the highest bounty in the world at the time of £8,000, today's equivalent of $236,000. At Ned Kelly's last stand, he was finally captured by police in the famous Glen Rowan incident, where he and his gang dressed in armour made from stolen plough mouldboards. The shootout left Kelly the only survivor of his gang, and he was sentenced to hang at the old Melbourne jail, despite petitions and thousands of signatures from supporters and sympathisers who protested for his release. His last words were reported to have been, "Such is life." Today, Ned Kelly has gone down in history as an Australian icon, with numerous works of art, films, books and TV shows made, adding him into Australian folklore. Although there are just as many people who only see him as a thug and brutal murderer, not deserving of his romanticisation in Australian history. By the end of the 19th century, bushrangers became less of a threat, and there are a few reasons for this. New infrastructure such as roads and railways made travel faster and safer, and the governments built an electric telegraph system which made it easier for police to respond to crimes committed by bushrangers. Adding to that fact, the police forces had become more organised, experienced, and developed better tactics to aid them in the capture and arrest of outlaws. Bushrangers are a part of Australian history and culture, sometimes romanticised as horse-riding Robin Hoods, who gave back to the communities just as much as they stole, and often remembered as rebels who fought for injustice against their colonial oppressors. In actuality, very few of the bushrangers were the polite and gentle romantic heroes of the Australian bush. Many of them were brutal killers, thieves, who stole from hard-working innocent settlers, sometimes committing atrocities with no rhyme or reason. In contrast, adding to that fact, many reforms made inroads into Australian law due to the crimes committed by bushrangers. An inquest into Victorian police after Ned Kelly's death found widespread corruption and poor police conduct, effectively ending the careers of a number of police officers, including that of Chief Commissioner Standish. Another example is that of the Clark brothers. After their death sentences, Sir Henry Parkes, politician and Premier of the colony of New South Wales, began campaigning for educational reforms, stating that many bushrangers were victims of circumstance, poorly educated, and that schools in rural areas would be beneficial in helping to eradicate the problem. Whether the legacy of the Australian bushrangers is seen as positive or negative is still being debated to this day. Thanks for watching. This has been the first episode on the Bushrangers series here on Shadow Matter. Comment below with your thoughts and if there's a particular episode that you would like to see. If you would like one of your comments to show up right here on the screen, then start a comment with Shadow Shoutout. And if you like this video, then don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe to see more content like this. and hit that notifications bell to keep up to date with the latest videos. And together, we can explore the strange, the terrifying, the unknown, the shadow matter.